This is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today we're going to take a look at this lovely book. It's all about the Lindisfarne Gospels. It's by Faden and the author Janet Backhouse. So let me tell you a little bit about the Lindisfarne Gospels. himself had visited the island to plead with him, Cuthbert bowed to pressure to accept election as a bishop, and the following Easter he was consecrated at York by Archbishop Theodore of Canterbury. For the short space of 2 years, St. Cuthbert returned to his earlier itinerant life. Then, feeling that the end of his life was approaching, he retired to his hermitage on Farne Island. One of his last miracles, used by Bede to demonstrate the virtue of obedience, kept a group of monks from Lindisfarne imprisoned on the island by a storm for an entire week because they had neglected to obey his instructions to cook and eat a goose hanging ready in his little guest house. He died on the 20th of March, 687, attended at last by a small group of his brethren, and his passing was signalled across the sea to Holy Island by the waving of torches. Cuthbert himself realised that he would be venerated as a saint, and that his tomb would quickly attract pilgrims. He would have preferred a simple grave on Farne sands at low tide. According to Simeon of Durham, the manuscript was the Lindisfarne Gospels. So this image here is the opening of St. Cuthbert's grave in 698. The monks display their astonishment at finding his body miraculously undecayed. This was later to be removed to Durham. Of Bilfrith's life, nothing at all is known except that he was an anchorite or hermit, as St. Cuthbert himself had been. He was also a priest. His name appears at the head of the second column on the page devoted to anchorites in the Lindisfarne Liber Vitae, and its position in relation to other known names suggests that he probably died during the latter part of the 8th century. The high regard in which anchorites were held is reflected in the fact that only two classes of people, both largely of royal blood, are placed before them 1167. 4 collects to honour of St. Cuthbert. The collects are accompanied by a note recording that they were written out for Bishop Elvsage by Aldred, the provost, at a place called Oakley, on a feast of St. Lawrence, which was also the 5th night of the moon. Elvsage was Bishop of Chester Street between 968 and 990, and the feast of St. Lawrence, the 10th of August, coincided with the 5th night of the moon in 970. Oakley appears to be identifiable as a place in Wessex on the road between Salisbury and Blandford. It seems likely that Elvsage, accompanied by Aldred, was in attendance upon King Edgar at the appropriate time. In the Lindisfarne Gospels colophon, which must be earlier than the note in the Durham ritual, because in it Aldred describes himself only as a priest. He goes on to tell us that each Gospel was glossed with a separate special intention. Matthew was for God and St. Cuthbert, Mark for the bishop, Luke for the community, with the addition of 8 oars of silver for his induction, and John for the sake of his own soul, with 4 oars of silver for God and St. Cuthbert. This suggests that his work on the manuscript was intended to establish him in the community at Chester Street. It probably dates from shortly after the middle of the 10th century. So, before I carry on with any more reading, I'll probably begin the text of the Gospels in another video. Let's see if we can find some images of the Gospels, preferably the colour ones, for you to see. I think they're a little bit further on in the book. Here we go. So I think this is what they call a carpet page, because it looks like a carpet. A cross carpet page introducing St. Jerome's letter to Pope Damasus. There. And this page on the right is a major decorated initial page at the beginning of St. Jerome's letter to Pope Damasus. So like a big initial letter. Obviously it's all in Latin, but the colours are still amazing after all these years. And then on the right, this is the 3rd in Edfrith's 16-page sequence of arcaded canon tables. In this example,